One thing to note about this battlefield before we move on is there's a real variation in the strategic value that we see in a lot of different positions across this map. So I've already described some of them. Spaces like the preamble, which is fairly devoid of any sort of combat opportunities. The player territory, which allows a lot of sort of occluded movement here. Flanks, the dead zone, which is the negative space here. So each of these areas, each of these spaces have different strategic value to the player, and they can sort of look at these spaces and kind of read that and kind of make a strategic plan here. So that variance is really what makes this battlefield more interesting. So it's essentially the puzzle the designers created for the player for this particular encounter. So if we were to look at a space like this, for instance, this space lacks that variance, and so the player has a lot of choices here, but most of them are pretty much the same. Most of the cover positions have very similar strategic value, and it doesn't really matter if you move to this one or this one, for instance. It's not really much of a difference. I mean, of course, there is some difference here. These positions, for instance, along the walls have are close to the walls, meaning that if you are the player and you're on the left side here, enemies will have a tough time attacking you on your left. But back to my point, because this space is relatively monotonous, this space presents too many choices that mostly feel the same, and so it feels like the player's choices are essentially inconsequential. And this might be fine if in maybe a quick setup, one particular area in your level where you are, actually want the player to sort of feel that emotion as if their choices don't matter. But on the whole, we want the player to feel the opposite. We want the player to make interesting choices and feel like there are consequences to them. We want them to look around the battlefield, weigh their options, all the possible risks and rewards, and then act on it, and then find out what happens, essentially. So this space is lacking in what I'd call strategic contrast. So this is a space with low strategic contrast. The strategic value between one position and another is fairly unclear. It's ambiguous. So if we were to look at instead a space like this, for instance, this has pretty good strategic contrast. So here there is there's a variance of high and low cover, as you can see. There is a variance in the shape of the cover and also in the sort of direction that it's pointed in. We've got some stuff that's sort of on the diagonal. We've got sort of this room right here that provides cover sort of in the lateral direction. So we are supporting a number of different, or just we are supporting more than one front vector. And we even have this small sort of refuge space up here. And we'll get to the idea of spaces like that in a moment, or in a little bit. But, essentially there are a lot of options here, but they all feel fairly different. And there is so the player can sort of scan this environment and easily read the affordances here. They can easily read the strategic differences because of that sense of strategic contrast. So the shapes actually speak and suggest courses of action. The player is encouraged to engage with essentially what is a puzzle that the player, or that the designer has created here, as they sort of move carefully around the battlefield. And if they choose poorly, then they can try to break that apart and figure out where they made a poor choice, and they can analyze it and understand why that happened. They can also anticipate enemy movement. So since enemies should be programmed to use, or at least look like they are using the same sort of affordances and logic that a human player would use. The affordances of the space, they pretty much are using the space in the same way as the player. You should be able to sort of look at this and kind of make a educated guess about where the enemies are going to move next, and then plan your own actions accordingly. So having a lot more of sort of a push and pull. So if we were to look back in this space, for instance, enemy movement, much like the players, will be unpredictable because the enemy choices, also like the players, are inconsequential. They're not going to weigh one choice versus another. Combat's going to feel a lot more random in a space like this. So